Hello and welcome to Investment Insight. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's break down what's happening in the markets today in a clear and simple way. So, I want you to imagine for a second that you run a mid-sized factory, maybe down in Texas.
Okay, I'm with you.
Right. And you just bought this massive shipment of steel bolts from South Korea, to build your products.
Pretty standard supply chain stuff, yeah.
Exactly. But then tomorrow, the U.S. government hits you with this devastating new tax. And it's not because the bolts are Korean. It's actually because the South Korean factory that sold them to you, they can't digitally prove where the iron ore was mined 3 years ago.
Yeah, and that's the new reality. The era of the simple border wall is just completely dead.
It really is.
Like the physical trade barriers we used to think about, right?
Right.
Just putting a flat tax on a shipping container because of the flag on the side of the ship, that's evolved into something far more intricate.
Oh, absolutely.
We are moving from, blunt geography to this really microscopic supply chain tracing.
Which is exactly the core of our deep dive today. We're pulling from a massive stack of recent analysis, Supreme Court rulings from earlier this year, policy sheets from the U.S. Trade Representative, and some deep economic reports on global supply chains.
Right. There's a lot of data to sift through.
Yeah, and the goal is to understand this massive structural shift in global trade that is happening right now as we sit here in mid-July 2026.
It's a huge shift.
But before we get into the weeds, I do want to make something crystal clear for you listening. Because we are analyzing policies enacted under the current U.S. President Donald Trump, we need to state up front that we are entirely neutral here.
Yes, very important point.
Right. We're not endorsing or criticizing the politics of this administration. Our only mission today is to, unpack the mechanics of these laws, impartially report on the source material, and figure out what the data actually means for you as an investor.
A very necessary disclaimer, I think, because the mechanics here are fascinating, regardless of where you sit politically. And honestly, the market has actually been fundamentally misreading the situation over the past few months.
They really have.
Yeah, if you only read the financial headlines recently, you probably think the era of massive tariffs is, ending.
Right. Let's start right there with that illusion.
Okay.
Because to understand where this new, I guess we'll call it a regulatory tariff system is going, we have to look at the legal earthquake that happened back in February of 2026.
Oh, yeah, the IEEPA ruling.
Exactly. The Supreme Court handed down this massive ruling regarding something called the IEEPA. So walk us through what that actually is and why the court struck it down.
Sure. So IEEPA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Historically, it was designed as like an emergency button for the president to deal with extraordinary threats.
Like wartime stuff.
Right, exactly. Think freezing the assets of a hostile foreign nation during a crisis. But over time, administrations just started using it as an everyday tool to slap broad, sweeping tariffs on entire countries, mostly to balance trade deficits.
Just bypassing Congress completely.
Yeah, pretty much. So the Supreme Court stepped in this February and basically ruled that the president cannot use an emergency national security law to conduct routine economic policy.
Okay, so the courts basically said you can't use the Emergency Fire Acts to chop your daily firewood.
That is a great way to put it, yeah.
And the fallout from that ruling was just absolute chaos in the markets. I mean, according to the recent data, up to $175 billion might have to be refunded to importers who paid those invalidated tariffs.
It's a staggering amount of money.
It's insane. It's no wonder traders started popping champagne, assuming free trade was back.
Well, the champagne was definitely premature. The administration didn't abandon the concept of tariffs at all. They just they changed their legal toolkit.
They found new laws to use.
Exactly. They moved away from the IEEPA, which the courts rejected, and pivoted to incredibly sturdy, older frameworks. Specifically, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
I really want to focus on Section 301 because looking at the analysis, this seems to be the new weapon of choice. Why is this law so much harder for the courts to strike down?
It all comes down to the mechanism behind it. IEEPA was a dictatorial stroke of a pen, right? The president declares an emergency, boom, taxes go up.
Very fast, very simple.
Right. Section 301, however, is a deeply bureaucratic process. It requires the government to launch a formal investigation, gather hard evidence of unfair trade practices, hold public hearings, and basically create this massive paper trail.
So they have receipts.
Exactly. Once that bureaucratic gauntlet is completed, judges are extremely hesitant to overturn it because the administration can literally point to thousands of pages of documented evidence justifying the tariff.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy for a second. Under the old system, the government used a sledgehammer. They just smashed every product coming out of a specific country with a blanket tax.
Right.
But now that the courts took the sledgehammer away, they've gone to the shed and brought out a set of highly precise scalpels.
Yes.
Actually, you know what? It sounds more like a biopsy needle. They aren't just cutting, they're
Yeah.
extracting specific data from the supply chain to see if it's infected with something they don't like.
That is the perfect way to visualize it, a
Mm.
biopsy needle. And to see that in action, I mean, we only need to look at what happened this very week with Brazil.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah, Brazil is the very first major test case of this new regulatory era.
The details on this are just wild to me. So, on July 16th, the U.S. announced a final 25% tariff on Brazil, which officially takes effect on July 22nd.
Right.
But they aren't taxing everything. It only targets about 18% of Brazil's exports to the U.S., which translates to roughly $15 billion.
Yeah, and you really have to pay attention to the justification here. The U.S. is not claiming a broad trade imbalance with Brazil.
It's not about the money.
No, they are using this Section 301 scalpel to punish specific domestic behaviors inside Brazil.
Wow.
The administration cited Brazil's digital trade policies, intellectual property violations, and environmental issues. Specifically, illegal logging in the Amazon.
Okay, here's where I really struggle with this, though. Because hitting a country for bad logging practices sounds great on paper, right?
Sure.
But I was looking at the exemption list for this tariff. The U.S. explicitly exempted beef, coffee, and aircraft.
Yep.
If you want to punish a country for deforestation, why on earth would you exempt beef and coffee, which are huge drivers of that very industry?
It seems backwards, right? But you have to look at the dual mandate of this new policy.
Okay.
The administration is trying to maximize regulatory pressure on a foreign government without causing immediate inflation for the American voter.
Oh, I see.
It is a cynical but frankly politically brilliant maneuver. They know that if the price of your morning coffee or your fast food burger doubles overnight, the American consumer will absolutely revolt.
Right, the voters would hate it.
Exactly. So coffee and beef get a free pass, while specialized industrial goods get slapped with a 25% tax.
That is incredible. They are basically weaponizing access to the American consumer market to force Brazil to change its domestic environmental laws, but very carefully shielding our own grocery bills.
That's exactly what they're doing.
But how do you even enforce that at a busy port? I mean, a customs officer isn't sniffing the wood or checking the digital policies of a shipping container.
No, it's all enforced digitally through harmonized system codes, or HS codes.
HS codes, okay.
Yeah, every single product imported into the U.S. has a specific code attached to it. So the custom software simply flags the codes for the targeted industrial goods and applies that 25% tax automatically.
While letting the codes for coffee beans just sail right through.
Precise.
Okay, so hitting a stationary target like a Brazilian logging operation via product codes, that makes sense. But what happens when the, I guess, bad practice is hidden inside a product that crosses 3 different borders before it gets to us?
This is where it gets really complicated.
Right. How does the scalpel cut through that? Because this leads us directly to the new forced labor proposals, which seem infinitely more complex.
This is by far the most intricate part of the new trade landscape. So on June 2nd, the U.S. Trade Representative proposed a new round of Section 301 tariffs specifically targeting forced labor.
Okay.
The proposal outlines a 12.5% additional tariff for countries like South Korea, Japan, China, and India, and then a 10% tariff for places like Canada, Mexico, and the EU.
Hold on, I need to challenge this because my first reaction reading that in the data was total confusion.
I don't blame you.
I mean, I understand scrutiny on China or India regarding labor laws, but South Korea, Japan, the EU, are we seriously accusing our closest democratic allies of using forced labor in their factories?
We are not. And that distinction is really, really vital. The U.S. is not arguing that a car rolling off an assembly line in Tokyo or Seoul was built by forced labor.
Okay, then what are they saying?
The argument is about porous borders. The U.S. is essentially saying that South Korea and Japan's import regulations are too weak to stop tainted intermediate materials, things like rare earth metals or battery chemicals mined with forced labor in China or Southeast Asia, from sneaking into the parts that eventually become that car.
So let me get this straight. if a Korean battery manufacturer buys cheap lithium from a questionable source in China, puts it into a battery, and tries to sell that battery to the U.S. is taxing the whole battery.
Yeah, we are essentially forcing South Korea to police China on our behalf.
That is wild.
It is. You were describing the exact mechanism.
Say.
The U.S. is effectively demanding a background check for every single bolt, microchip, and battery cell. You can no longer just point to a Made in Korea sticker.
Right.
You have to trace the family tree of that product all the way back to the raw dirt it was mined from.
But what does that actually look like for a regular business? Because the level of software, auditing, and compliance required to trace a Tier 3 supplier's raw materials, I mean, that sounds like an operational nightmare.
It is a massive operational hurdle. In this new era, a global company's competitive edge is no longer just having the lowest price or the best quality.
Right. What is it then?
The new moat is what we call data capability. It is the ability to digitally trace, verify, and legally prove the origin of every single component.
Wow.
If a South Korean company cannot produce that data, they get hit with a 12.5% tariff. The U.S. is basically telling the world, clean up your supply chain to our standards or pay the price at the border.
Okay, but if the U.S. can trace a battery cell all the way to a mine in China, where does this tracing stop? Because looking at the recent analysis, the administration is pushing this scalpel into some deeply unexpected territory.
Oh, absolutely.
We aren't just talking about supply chains anymore. We are talking about using tariffs to interfere with foreign healthcare. Walk me through what is happening with Germany right now.
Yeah, so the USTR recently opened a Section 301 investigation into Germany's prescription drug pricing.
Okay.
Germany, like a lot of European nations, uses strict government price controls to keep the cost of innovative, patented medications relatively low for its citizens.
Which, sounds like a pretty standard domestic healthcare policy. How on earth does the U.S. justify turning that into a trade tariff issue?
The economic logic is aggressive, but it's pretty straightforward. Developing a new drug costs pharmaceutical companies billions of dollars in research and development.
Right, the R&D is insanely expensive.
Exactly. So the U.S. argues that because Germany refuses to pay market rates for these drugs, the pharmaceutical companies are forced to recoup those billions of dollars by charging American consumers sky-high prices.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Essentially, the U.S. is arguing that the American healthcare system is unfairly subsidizing global medical innovation.
Wow. So the U.S. is using the threat of tariffs on German exports to try and force Germany to pay more for medicine just so American prices might eventually come down.
That's the goal, yes.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It means literally no domestic policy is safe from a trade dispute.
None.
Well, what about our immediate neighbors? Surely Canada and Mexico are insulated by our free trade agreements.
They're absolutely not insulated.
For real.
Just look at the USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. The U.S. is not just rubber stamping its renewal. They are using the renewal process to demand much stricter rules of origin for auto parts coming out of Mexico.
Let me guess, because just like with South Korea, they are worried about Chinese parts using Mexico as a backdoor into the U.S. market.
You hit the nail on the head.
And the numbers back up that paranoia, too. The data shows the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico exploded to an astonishing $197 billion in 2025. You don't hit a number like that just selling avocados, right? That is heavy manufacturing bypassing American tariffs.
Exactly. The U.S. sees Chinese companies setting up final assembly warehouses in Mexico just wash the Made in China label off their goods.
Ah, I see.
So the rules of origin are being tightened. But beyond that, you also have Section 232 tariffs, which, remember, are based on national security.
Right. These are the tariffs on critical materials like steel, aluminum, and copper.
Yes, and under Section 232, even a close ally like Canada or Mexico isn't safe. The ultimate goal of Section 232 isn't just to collect a tax at the border.
What is it?
It is to force companies to move actual physical production facilities onto U.S. soil. If you want to sell critical infrastructure materials in the U.S. without the constant risk of sudden national security tariffs, you need to pour the concrete and build the factory inside the United States.
Okay, let's bring this down to earth for the listener, because we've covered a dizzying amount of ground today.
We really have.
We've got the Supreme Court striking down the IEEPA sledgehammer, the 301 scalpel hitting Brazil's logging, the background checks on Korean supply chains, and this wild pressure on German healthcare.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So for someone listening right now, trying to understand the economy or manage their investments, what is the bottom line here?
The first major takeaway is that the old logic of analyzing global trade is dead.
Completely dead.
Yes. It used to be simple. You look at a map, you identify which countries have high tariffs with the U.S., and you avoid investing in companies headquartered there.
That makes sense.
Right. But that geographic strategy is useless now. Tariffs are no longer about the country on the map. They are about the invisible supply chain underneath it.
Okay, so if the old map is useless, who are the winners in this new environment?
The winners are companies, and this is regardless of their official nationality, that have done one of two things.
Okay, what's the first?
First, companies that have completely localized their production inside the United States. They are heavily investing in U.S. automation, logistics, and power grids.
Makes sense. You bypass the border entirely.
Exactly. And second, companies that possess perfectly transparent, verifiable, non-Chinese supply chains and have the data capability to prove it to a customs agent.
So if I'm researching a company as an investor, asking where is your headquarters is the wrong question.
Totally the wrong question.
The right question is, do you have a physical footprint in the U.S., and can your software track every single screw you use back to the raw ore?
That is the exact due diligence required today. A Japanese corporation with a massive self-contained factory in Ohio has a huge competitive advantage over an American company that relies on imported, untraceable parts.
Wow.
Which actually brings us to the hidden victims of this new era.
Who's that?
Mid-sized American manufacturers.
Hold on, wait. I thought the entire point of this Trump-era policy shift was America first. If this highly surgical tariff system is accidentally gutting the mid-sized American manufacturer, isn't the policy a massive failure?
Well, it is a brutal contradiction of the policy.
Yeah.
Think about it. A massive multinational corporation has the capital to build proprietary tracing software and audit their Tier 3 suppliers in Vietnam.
Sure, they have billions to spend on compliance.
Right. But a mid-sized American manufacturer relying on imported raw materials simply doesn't have that budget. The compliance costs alone could crush them.
Oh, man.
And if they can't afford the tracing software, and they get hit with that 12.5% tariff by default, they really have only one option left to survive.
They have to pass that cost directly to the consumer.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the biggest, ugliest consequence for the everyday listener: inflation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
If you force the entire global supply chain to restructure itself, to build new factories in expensive locations, and to implement massive digital tracking systems, you are permanently raising the baseline cost of making things.
That makes total sense.
The Federal Reserve watches this dynamic very, very closely. A surgical tariff might protect the price of beef and coffee today, but the cumulative effect of these data mandates is inherently, structurally inflationary.
And if prices stay high, inflation stays high. If inflation stays high, the Fed keeps interest rates high. That domino effect hits every single listener's mortgage, car loan, and credit card rate.
Exactly.
It is just fascinating how a law designed to track a bolt in South Korea ends up dictating the mortgage rate for a house in Texas.
Everything is connected. It really is. But before we wrap up today, I do want to leave you with one final kind of provocative concept to mull over.
I love those. Let's hear it.
What we are really witnessing right now is the birth of something economists are calling regulatory exports.
Regulatory exports. I mean, the U.S. exports airplanes, software, movies. How do you export a regulation?
Well, historically, trade was purely about moving physical goods across a border. But today, the U.S. is weaponizing its massive, incredibly lucrative consumer market.
Right. Everyone wants to sell to Americans.
Exactly. The U.S. is looking at the rest of the world and saying, if you want the privilege of selling to the American consumer, you have to adopt American standards.
So we aren't just buying their products. We're literally demanding they run their countries the way we want them to.
Exactly. Through these highly surgical, data-driven tariffs, we are forcing foreign nations to adopt American standards for labor practices, supply chain transparency, environmental protections, and, as we saw with Germany, maybe even healthcare pricing.
That is just...
Wow. We aren't just importing physical goods anymore. The United States is literally exporting its laws to the rest of the globe.
That is a staggering way to look at it. The giant tariff wall hasn't been torn down at all. It has just been transformed into a microscopic digital maze of regulations that the entire world is now forced to navigate.
Beautifully said.
It definitely changes how you will look at the Made in sticker on your very next purchase. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the new reality of global trade. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button.